Nobody hugged me at my own mother's funeral. Not my stepfather, not my half-brother, not my aunt who used to babysit me as a child. People I'd known my entire life walked right past me at that funeral home, offering their arms to everyone standing near me and somehow never once to me, like I was invisible, like I hadn't spent the last 2 years of my mother's life sitting beside her more than any of them combined. And then her lawyer stood up during the reading of her will and read one single line that made every single person in that room finally understand exactly what they'd done. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, at the exact moment you needed to be seen the most, keep watching, because I promise you this story ends somewhere worth staying for. My name is Camille. I was 32 years old the year my mother Yolanda passed away, working as a school librarian and raising 2 kids mostly on my own after a difficult divorce that had left me stretched thin in every possible direction. I was my mother's oldest child from her first marriage, before she met my stepfather Gerald and had my half-brother Darius. And somewhere along the way, without anyone ever officially declaring it, I became the outsider in a family that had technically always been mine. Gerald never mistreated me exactly, not in any way you could point to directly, but there was always a subtle distance in how he spoke to me, a formality that never quite matched the warmth he showed Darius, his biological son, the one who got introduced first at gatherings, the one whose accomplishments got mentioned before mine ever did. Darius was 28, worked in insurance sales, and had absorbed enough of that same quiet distance over the years that by adulthood, our relationship felt more like polite acquaintances than actual siblings, despite sharing a mother and a childhood home for most of our lives. My mother tried, in her own way, to bridge that gap, but she was one woman navigating a blended family that had never fully blended, and I don't think she ever fully understood how much distance had settled in around me over the years. Distance I mostly stopped mentioning, because mentioning it never seemed to change anything. What she and I did have, despite everything else, was a closeness that belonged only to the two of us. She'd been a hairdresser for over 30 years, running a small salon out of a converted room in her house, and every Thursday evening, after she closed up for the day, I brought my kids over and we sat in her kitchen while she cooked, telling stories about her own childhood, about my grandmother, about the early years of her marriage to my father before things fell apart. She never once made me feel like the outsider in those moments. In her kitchen, I was simply her daughter, the same as I'd always been. When she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, the news arrived so suddenly and so late stage that the doctors were careful not to make promises about how much time we might have. Everything about how my family behaved around her began shifting immediately, though not in the direction you might hope. Gerald, who'd always kept a certain professional distance even within his own marriage, seemed almost paralyzed by the diagnosis, present physically, but emotionally checked out in a way that left my mother needing far more support than he seemed capable of providing. Darius visited when convenient, usually stopping by for 20 or 30 minutes on his way somewhere else, always managing to mention his own stresses, his own busy schedule, before the conversation ever turned fully toward how she was actually feeling. I became the one who managed nearly everything else. I coordinated her treatment schedule around my own job and my kids' school schedules, sat with her through chemotherapy sessions that left her too weak to speak for hours afterward, learned which foods she could tolerate and which ones made the nausea worse, held her hair back during the nights the treatment made her sick, and eventually helped her manage the slow, cruel decline that cancer brings when it finally stops responding to anything the doctors try. "You're the one who's actually here, Kami," she told me one evening, About 8 months into her treatment, her voice thinner than it used to be, but her eyes still holding that same warmth I'd known my entire life. Gerald means well, but he doesn't know how to be present for something this hard. Darius calls, but he doesn't really sit with me the way you do. You've always been the one who shows up, even after everything with this family that was never quite fair to you. I told her I didn't need her to acknowledge any of that being there for her was never something I needed credit for. But she squeezed my hand anyway and told me she'd been paying closer attention than I probably realized to all of it. The small unfairnesses I'd absorbed quietly for years without ever making it anyone else's problem. She passed away on a rainy morning in late autumn, in the hospital, with me sitting beside her holding her hand, having spent the previous night there, because something in me since the end was closer than the doctors were officially saying yet. Gerald arrived 20 minutes after she'd already passed, having been reached by phone, but taking his time getting there. And Darius arrived nearly an hour later, having been at a work event he hadn't wanted to leave early. I called the rest of the family, my aunt, my cousins, coordinating the details nobody else seemed prepared to handle in that moment. My own grief pushed temporarily aside because someone needed to manage the logistics of losing a person while everyone else stood around looking lost. The funeral was arranged for the following week, and Gerald insisted on making most of the decisions himself. Decisions about the venue, the flowers, the guest list, decisions that felt strange to watch unfold from the periphery of a life I'd spent the last 2 years managing more closely than anyone. I didn't fight him on any of it. I was too exhausted, too raw, to insist on being included in choices that felt, in that moment, secondary to the actual grief of losing my mother. The funeral itself was held at a modest but well-attended funeral home, filled with people from her salon clientele, from the neighborhood, from decades of a life she'd built with genuine warmth toward everyone she encountered. I stood near the front during the viewing, greeting people as they arrived, accepting condolences, watching an endless stream of hugs pass around me toward Gerald, toward Darius, toward my aunt, and somehow, again and again, past me entirely. At first, I told myself it was simply an oversight, that people were focused on Gerald as the surviving spouse, on Darius as the son who'd grown up in that house his entire life. But as the hours passed and the pattern continued, hug after hug directed at everyone standing near me but never quite reaching me, I began to understand that this wasn't accidental. This was simply how my family had always treated me, made visible now in the starkest possible setting. At the exact moment I most needed someone's arms around me. My aunt, who'd known me since I was a baby, hugged Darius warmly, held Gerald's hands and spoke softly to him, and then turned to me and offered only a brief, formal nod, saying she was sorry for my loss in a tone that sounded like she was speaking to a distant relative rather than the child she'd once babysat every summer. I stood there in that funeral home, surrounded by people who'd known me my entire life, feeling more alone than I think I'd ever felt, watching my own grief go unacknowledged, while everyone around me received the comfort I desperately needed and somehow wasn't being offered. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who should have comforted you and felt completely invisible instead, tell me in the comments, because I promise you the rest of this story is going to matter to you. The service itself was beautiful in the way funerals sometimes manage to be despite everything happening underneath them, filled with tributes to my mother's kindness, her skill, the decades she'd spent making people feel beautiful and cared for in her small salon. Gerald gave a eulogy about their marriage that felt sincere, if incomplete, never once mentioning the 2 years of caregiving that had fallen almost entirely on me while he struggled to show up emotionally. Darius didn't speak at all, standing near the casket looking uncomfortable in his suit, checking his phone twice during moments I found myself unable to look away from. I sat in the front pew, my 2 kids beside me, feeling the absence of any comforting hand on my shoulder throughout the entire service, an absence that felt sharper than almost any other part of that day. After the burial, everyone gathered at Gerald's house for the repast, and I arrived already emotionally depleted, uncertain how much more of that particular kind of loneliness I could absorb in a single day. About an hour into the gathering, a lawyer named MS. Fairweather arrived, carrying a briefcase, explaining that my mother had asked her specifically to conduct a brief reading that afternoon rather than scheduling a separate appointment, wanting the matter handled while the family was already together. We gathered in Gerald's living room, an uncomfortable collection of people who'd spent the entire day failing to comfort each other properly, and MS. Fairweather opened her briefcase with a calm efficiency that felt out of place amid the exhaustion in that room. "Before I read the formal will," she said, "I need to share that Yolanda specifically requested I include a personal note as part of today's proceedings, something she wrote roughly 6 months ago during one of her longer hospital stays." She pulled a single folded sheet of paper from a plain envelope, and the room, already quiet, seemed to still further. She was very specific. "MS," Fairweather continued, "that I read this note before discussing anything else, and that I read it exactly as written." My mother's handwriting on that page looked thinner than I remembered, but unmistakably hers, and MS. Fairweather began reading in a voice that carried a gentleness suited to the words themselves. "To my family," she read. "I want to say something plainly because I don't think I said it clearly enough while I was still able to say things out loud." She paused, glancing around the room. "These past 2 years have shown me exactly who shows up when things get hard, and I want to make sure that truth doesn't get lost in whatever happens after I'm gone." Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Darius stared at his hands. "Gerald, I love you, and I know you tried in the ways you knew how to try. But I want you to understand that trying isn't always the same as showing up, and there were too many nights I needed someone beside me and found myself alone instead." Gerald's face had gone pale, his jaw tight. "Darius, you're my son, and I love you completely. But I want you to know that 20 minutes here and there, however well-intentioned, isn't the same as actually being present for someone who's dying. I hope you understand the difference someday, before it costs you something you can't get back." Darius said nothing, his eyes fixed on the floor. "There is one person who never once made me feel like a burden during these 2 years, who managed every appointment, every hard night, every moment I was too sick or too scared to manage on my own. MS. Fairweather Reed, her voice softening. One person who has spent her entire life being treated like the outsider in this family, despite being the only one who consistently showed up for every single person in it, including me, especially me." She looked up briefly, and though she wasn't looking directly at me, I felt every word land somewhere deep in my chest. "Camille has given more to this family than any of us have ever properly acknowledged, and I am ashamed that it took me dying to finally say this plainly. She is my daughter, completely and without qualification, and I need everyone in this room to understand that clearly, today in front of each other." I felt my breath catch, tears already streaming down my face, my children beside me reaching for my hands without fully understanding why. I noticed, at every gathering over the years, how she was greeted last, hugged least, included only partially, and I am sorry I didn't say something sooner, while I still had the chance to correct it myself rather than leaving these words to do it for me. MS. Fairweather set the letter down gently. That single line I want read separately exactly as she wrote it. she said quietly, picking the paper back up. "Camille, you were always my daughter first, before anything else this family ever became. I should have made sure everyone treated you that way while I was still here to insist on it." The room fell into a silence heavier than anything I'd experienced all day. My aunt's face had gone visibly ashamed. Gerald sat frozen, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Darius finally looked up, meeting my eyes for what felt like the first time in years. MS. Fairweather moved on to the formal will itself, which left the majority of my mother's modest but carefully managed savings and the salon property to be divided equally between Darius and me. A division I hadn't expected, and honestly, hadn't wanted framed as some kind of victory. This story was never about money for me, and I want to be clear about that, because what my mother left behind that actually mattered wasn't financial at all. What mattered was that single line, read aloud in a room full of people who'd spent an entire day failing to acknowledge my grief, finally forcing them to see what they'd been doing, not just that day, but for years. "I didn't realize," my aunt said quietly, after a long silence, her voice unsteady. "I didn't realize how it looked, how I made you feel today. I'm sorry, Camille." Gerald didn't say much of anything, sitting with an expression somewhere between shame and genuine grief, though he did eventually reach over and squeeze my hand briefly before excusing himself from the room entirely. Darius was the one who surprised me most. He crossed the room after MS. Fairweather finished, sat down beside me, and simply said, "I'm sorry, Camille. I don't have a good excuse. I just wasn't paying attention the way I should have been, not to Mom and not to you either." I didn't have a perfect response for him in that moment. I was too exhausted, too raw, too overwhelmed by an entire day of being unseen suddenly giving way to being seen all at once, in the most painful way possible. I left that house that evening and drove to my mother's salon, the small converted room attached to her house that would eventually become mine. And I sat in one of her old styling chairs, surrounded by the smell of hair products that still lingered faintly in the air. And I let myself cry properly for the first time all day, not because of the will, not because of the money, but because I missed her, plainly and completely. The particular kind of missing that leaves a hole shaped exactly like the person who's gone. In the weeks that followed, something shifted slowly in my family, not into some perfect reconciliation, but into something more honest than what had existed before. Darius started calling more regularly, awkward at first, unsure how to close a distance that had taken years to build, but trying in a way he hadn't before. Gerald remained distant in his own way, though he did eventually apologize properly, admitting he'd let his own emotional limitations create a gap between us he should have worked harder to close. I kept the salon running for a while, hired one of my mother's longtime stylists to manage it, and eventually turned part of it into a small community space where local kids could get haircuts before school photos at reduced prices, something I felt certain my mother would have wanted, given how much she'd always cared about making people feel presentable and cared for, regardless of what they could afford. Some evenings I still sit in that old styling chair, and I think about how strange it is that it took one single line, written months in advance and read aloud by a stranger, to finally make my family see something my mother had apparently understood clearly the entire time. That showing up consistently, quietly, without needing acknowledgement, was worth more than anything else any of us had to offer each other. People sometimes ask if that funeral day still bothers me, the hugs that went to everyone except me, the invisibility I felt standing in a room full of people who'd known me my whole life. It does, some days more than others. But I've also come to understand that my mother saw all of it, every slight I never mentioned, every subtle exclusion I absorbed quietly for years, and she made absolutely certain, before she ran out of time, that the truth would finally be spoken plainly, in a room full of people who could no longer pretend they hadn't heard it. So I'll leave you with the same question I still think about often. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to love you, would knowing that someone truly saw you all along, even silently, even without ever saying so out loud until it was almost too late, be enough to finally heal that particular kind of loneliness? Or does some part of that ache simply stay with you permanently, a reminder of every hug you didn't receive, even after the truth finally comes out?